Right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for being here. I am Quilt Alliance Project Manager Emma Parker, and I'm super excited to have you here today for a very quick whirlwind journey through the life cycle of the Quilt Alliance's oral history project, QSOS, or Quilters Save Our Stories. We have a really amazing QSOS interview planned with Zak Foster, and we'll go behind the scenes just a little bit and show you how we take that interview from getting started to a finished interview that is going to live on for posterity. So first, a few quick notes. I want to thank our Textile Talks sponsors. This is their logos, and they have really put their money where their mouth is, so to speak, and are supporting quilt history, quilt education, quilt preservation, and have made these conversations possible. So I definitely encourage you to check them out if you haven't already, because they're doing really amazing work, and we couldn't do our work without them. So thanks to them. We really appreciate it. A few quick housekeeping notes. Some of you, I think, have already figured this out, and I'm sure you've been on many Zoom events. But if you want to chat with your fellow attendees, you can use the chat function. There is a setting, I think, to send it either to panelists or to the entire audience. If you want to share with everyone who's watching, you can share with everyone or just send a note to the panelists. We may not see it immediately if we're talking, but it will come just to us. If you have a Q&A, we're going to show an interview with quiltmaker Zak Foster. And if you have questions for Zak or for me, you can put it in that Q&A function and we'll see it then when it's time for the Q&A. So there we go. That's our housekeeping. The project I want to talk about today is called Quilters S.O.S. Save Our Stories, and some of you may be familiar with it. It's an oral history project that was started by the Quilt Alliance in 1999, and it's a long-form audio recording interview. So it was quilt makers interviewing other quilt makers, and it's really covers sort of the whole sphere of quilt making. So how someone learned to quilt, their quilt making process, their family history, and sort of big ideas about the quilt world. So these interviews were recorded by quilt makers, usually in their own guild. It was one of the largest grassroots oral history interviews of its kind, which is pretty amazing. There's lots and lots of oral history collections, but this kind of collection that has been recorded by people on the ground talking with their friends and not experts going into a community is really rare. The interviews are now archived at the Library of Congress's American Folklife Center. They will be there until the Library of Congress closes, which I hope it never does. And we also have a new partner, which is the University of Kentucky's Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History. And they're really the cutting edge center for oral history and oral historian best practices in the country right now. So we're very excited to have them as a partner. In 2018, we started reconsidering how this project would work. So we wanted to revitalize the way that we present these interviews online. Originally, it's a little blurry, but this is what it looked like. There was a transcript of the interview that went on for pages and pages, and you could read the transcript, and that's it. Even though the interviews had been audio recorded, all you could do was read them and see a very small image. So in 1999, streaming audio is really more of a blips and bloops kind of thing. No one really envisioned that we would be able to hear or see people as they spoke for these recordings. So it's difficult to search if someone doesn't explicitly say something or if a word's misspelled. Searching for applique was really tricky because sometimes it had an accent and sometimes it didn't, and sometimes people wouldn't even say applique, but they would describe it. So as a research collection, it was not particularly useful. We are really excited with our work with the University of Kentucky to bring a totally new presentation to these interviews. We have over 1,200 that have been collected so far, and we're continuing to collect them now digitally. And we're excited about a new presentation for these interviews. So you can visit QSOS.quiltalliance.org. We'll share this link with you to see the interviews that we have processed so far. but it's amazing because you can hear the voices of quilt makers. So all of these interviews, some of the interviewees are now have passed away. You can hear their voices. In some cases, you can see video of them. We have new technology that lets us describe the interview. So you can not just search for what someone directly said, but for themes within interviews, compare and contrast them. So I'm going to show you what this looks like with a finished project, with Zak's finished interview. But first, I just want to thank Zak Foster, who is the quilt maker we're going to interview. I talked to him last week, and I'm going to show you our conversation. But we're super delighted to have him, and I think you guys are really going to enjoy it. So I prepared for the interview. I'm always a little bit nervous, and this one was not an exception. It was my first QSOS interview that I've done via Zoom, so that was a brand new experience. And I've never met Zak, so I did a little research. I creeped on his website and his Instagram and highlighted a few questions from our list of oral history questions that I thought seemed really especially applicable for him and his work, and kind of made some notes that I wanted to ask him about. And you'll notice that the name of today's lecture is, quote, "Tell me about the quilt you brought today." And that's usually the very first question that we ask in a QSOS interview. The interview typically starts from a touchstone quilt, which is a single quilt that an interviewee brings with them. And they talk about that as kind of a doorway into the rest of their quilt making work. So this is just a little clip of what you might find when you listen to a number of our QSOS interviews.
Okay, Shirley, we're ready to get started. If you would, tell us about the quilt that you have here today.
You've brought a beautiful and interesting quilt today. Tell us about it.
Will you tell me about the quilt that you brought for us today?
Tell us a little bit about the quilt that you brought in today.
Well, why don't we also start by you telling me about the piece that you brought today. When did you make it?
We just love this bright colors of this quilt you brought today. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Let's begin by talking about the quilt that you brought in.
So I hope that gives you a sense of how things usually get started. And I hope that you'll notice when I played my interview with Zak that I actually didn't start there. I had planned to, but he had very graciously reviewed the questions ahead of time and was very prepared and had a couple quilts he was thinking about. And as I looked at it, it made sense to sort of start with his touchstone quilt later in the interview, which I thought was a really important lesson about being flexible when you're going to have a conversation with someone. So I encourage you, once I start this interview, to listen for the moment where I finally get to go back to the kickoff question, tell me about the quilt you brought today. So I'm going to go ahead and fire up this interview. Here we go. We'll jump right in with this very first question. Tell me about your interest in quilt making and how you got started making quilts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, I think for a long time I was an artist in search of quilting. You know, I grew up in North Carolina, and North Carolina, as you know, has a long tradition of producing textiles, right? Right up into the 80s and kind of mid 80s, it kind of petered out. So I grew up surrounded in this landscape of textiles, but I didn't really have a personal connection. I know that my mom had a sewing machine when I grew up, but I didn't really see it being used that much. My first sewing memory was with her mom, who is now 104 years old, still kicking, wonderful lady. And I remember going to her house once and seeing that she was making a dress and being so fascinated. I was probably like 5 years old or so, being so fascinated with pattern paper, clothing pattern paper, like this brown, thin, and just so fragile. And I'm like, oh, sewing is so mysterious, you know, like how do we take these raw materials and make something? But then I didn't do anything with fabric for about 20, 25 years. I do a lot of drawing. I tried painting, screen printing, lithographs, I mean, all kinds of stuff, right? And it seemed like I kind of bounced from one to the other for the longest while. And then one day, about 6 or 7 years ago now, my friends started having their first kids, you know? And so I was like, okay, this is a time for me to try to make a quilt again. I had made one in college. it didn't line up all perfect and square, so I thought it was a total failure, and I just like tossed it to the side. And we can come back to that quilt in a little bit if you want. But I didn't quilt between college and 5 or 7 years ago. I didn't quilt for nearly a decade.
Wow.
And I picked it back up with baby quilts, and I've been hooked ever since. So that's kind of, I didn't learn from anybody in my family really. Well, that's not true. So I did learn a lot on YouTube, but my partner's mama in Eastern Tennessee was a big time quilter. And so I learned the basics online, but every holiday when we'd come home for Thanksgiving especially, we would sit and talk about like, oh, how do you do your binding? And, you know, she does that East Appalachian kind of thing where you like roll the back up over the top.
Oh yeah, uh-huh.
And those little details. I remember one time coming home from Thanksgiving Day, part of our family tradition is going to the movies after the big meal. Mamaw never did. She stayed home to clean the kitchen. Like, I don't know how you get to cook the meal and get stuck with it.
Yeah, that's a raw deal, but yeah.
Total raw deal. But Mamaw, I guess she was fine with it. She got to see her grandbabies, you know. But I came back from the movies that night, and she was sitting at the kitchen table with this quilt of mine that I had brought to work on, and she was just sewing on that binding. And I treasure that quilt because I can look at those stitches and know those aren't my stitches. Bless her heart, her eyes at that time weren't the best. But it's like it's her signature there in the quilt. And I treasure it. It's a beautiful thing.
Helping with the binding really is, that's an act of love for sure.
For sure.
That's my least favorite part. But so before you started quilting, did you have sort of a notion or idea about quilts and who made quilts? I mean, do you have any preconceived ideas about that? Or was it just something that was, you know, you did once, you thought, meh, or it was a continually evolving idea?
I think so if I'm being honest, the very first quilt I ever made was a 4-square patch. I made in the 3rd grade because we had like Laura Ingalls Wilder Day at school. We had just read Little House on the Prairie, and I'm like, oh, we're gonna do all these activities. So Zach made him a little 4-square patch that turned into a pillow, and that was cute. But I think I didn't go any further, my 3rd grade self, because in my mind, quilts were often like poofy, polyester felt. Nothing. Well, I don't want to say nothing is polyester felt, but it's not the best for the planet. But if you like your quilts poofy, that's fine. But that was the image I had in my mind, and so it took a long time for me to realize, oh, there's other things you can fill quilts with.
Sure.
I also thought quilts had to be patterned, right? But now we have seen in the last many years that there's many different ways to be a quilt, and I'm thankful for that.
Yeah, that's so true. There's many ways to be a quilt. And you mentioned you learned a little bit with Mimon, a little bit on YouTube. Or how did you really come to starting to make quilts, and what were you looking at in those early days to get a sense of the process?
In the early days, I was just trying to find patterns that I liked. So I basically just like replicate some tried and true monkey wrench or something. Pinwheel, my very first quilt I saw to fruition all the way through from patching to binding was a pinwheel quilt. But some things have held in common from that first baby quilt because I sourced a lot of that fabric from remnants and salvage and things like that. Using repurposed materials is still 99% of what I use when I work now. But in the beginning, I was like, let me play by the rules. I wanted to learn the rules and learn techniques. And I made really pretty, precise, all my corners met kind of quilts. And then it didn't take too long before I discovered the quilts of Gee's Bend. And they obviously continue to have, for folks that are already familiar with my work, continue to have an influence on my work and on my approach. And a question I have in my mind that remains unresolved, and if anybody out there has thoughts, I'm on a search to figure this out. But there is the issue in my mind, at least, about appropriating quilts that have come out of that part of Alabama. And it's weird for me as a white male in this field to be saying like, oh, I love these quilts, they're beautiful, and how do I pay homage and respect to that tradition and the latitude that those women, and one man as far as I know, opened up with their design approaches. How do I pay respect and homage to that without appropriating it? You know, that's one thing that I think of quite a bit. But when I saw those quilts from G-Spin, I was like, here we go. There's some breathing room in this art form, you know? And I think especially if I had to put my finger on one quilter specifically, is Irene Williams. She's my spiritual quilting grandmother, I would like to think, if she'd have me. She worked a lot in solitude. She worked a lot by herself, not as communal as some of the other ladies. And she was just like, I'm gonna do what I want to do. Like one of my favorite quilts of hers are 2 basketball jerseys that she just cut up the side seams right down. There's another one there where she took a bright orange poncho and just like sewed the hood down flat. She didn't even like try to like cut the fabric out. She just sewed the hood down, pressed it on. And like, I love the space that she had around her work to create. And so when I saw her work, I'm like, yeah, there's something fun we can do here with this. And so I've been kind of searching ever since to like, what else can we do with this art form?
Sure, that's a great question and a great journey. And I think a lot of people maybe struggle a little bit with that notion of G-Spin and appropriation. And, you know, I think in the early days, particularly of the modern quilt movement, there was a little bit of wrestling with that, maybe acknowledged or unacknowledged. So I'm really interested to hear you talk about that. So your early quilts were really precise. How would you describe your work now? I mean, you mentioned you're a high school teacher, so you're not quilting full time all the time.
Well, it feels like it sometimes.
Yeah. So how would you describe the work that you make now, and where does it end up? Is really my favorite question about quilts. Is like, do you keep them? Do you sell them? Why are you doing it? And what are you making? That's a big question.
Yeah, like, well, why am I doing it? I can't think of a better way to spend my time, is probably the honest answer, right? I really enjoy finding ways to bring new life to fabric and textiles. Another artist I really admire is T.J. Muhammad, who talks about the hopefulness of discarded objects. And I just love that thought. I think he thinks of it in terms mostly of people who get overlooked in the margins of society, which is definitely something on my mind. But I think you can also think of it on a more tangible level, which is just, I see here in Brooklyn especially, I just see like clothes thrown out in the street like they're trash. And if we were just to wind the clock back 100, 150 years, cloth is one of the most valuable things a person could have, because it took so much labor to make that cloth. So to see it just so produced in such a mass fashion and then just so easily discarded is something that's just really bothersome to me on a personal level. So I find a lot of gratification in giving new life and giving them a little something they didn't have in their initial incarnation. So that said, that's a lot of my starting points for my work now, is the fabrics themselves. What I run across, what I find. I love, lately I've been making a few memorial quilts, memory quilts. I love thinking about the person that's being honored in this, especially with their clothing and what that means, whether I knew the person or not. I like to believe that you can tell something from somebody's clothes. You know, even if you didn't know them. Like if you found this shirt that I'm wearing now, the little patch on the elbow, you're like, oh, he never like pushes his sleeves up all the way. He's always like leaning on it and got a hole. Or I just was recently deconstructing a shirt that somebody gave me, and there was in the front shirt pocket, there's like a bunch of little like, little pieces of like soil and leaf matter and things like that. Like they had put something natural in their pocket at some point. I like to imagine this person, you know, walking through the woods or something. Who knows? Yeah. But I like starting with that point of inspiration, the fabric being the point of inspiration, and going from there. And it's important to me to remain open and sensitive to that process. I, like a lot of improv quilters, rarely have an idea of where the project's going when I start. And quilting has taught me, and I'm so thankful for this lesson, because quilting has taught me that sensitivity is a virtue. I think for a long time, I gave myself a hard time for being too sensitive to like loud noises and strong smells and lots of people in a room, you know, that kind of thing.
Sure.
But now I realize that the other side of that same coin is when I look at my design wall and I can see, okay, here's some fabric and here's some fabric, but what's the difference if I do this, right? And it's what Anne Truitt calls the just noticeable difference, right? Like there is a difference there, right? And what is it? And it's that sensitivity that sometimes is not my best friend, but sometimes is my best friend. That helps me see the difference. And so quilting has helped me accept that about myself as a person, and also realize that that's a virtue and a strength that I have as an artist. And so I'm very thankful for that. So being open to the process, starting with some fabric that has meaning and has some kind of substance and life of its own, being open to that influencing the process, I would say informs almost all the pieces that I make now.
Fantastic answer. So I'm skipping ahead slightly. We typically ask folks to bring a touchstone quilt, or sometimes more than one. Do you want to share one quilt that you feel like you is a touchstone for you, or says something about your work?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And, let's start with this one.
Okay, perfect.
Now, this is not, I'm just going to say, this is not the most beautiful quilt I've ever made, but it's important for a reason, because I can tell you a story about it.
Oh, those are the best ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a quilt 4 years ago, 2016. Like a lot of folks, like a little over half the country, I was really shocked at the way the 2016 election turned out.
Sure.
The president and I just don't agree on a lot of things, you know? And so after he won the Electoral College in 2016, I just felt like the rug had been pulled out from under me, a little bit lost at sea, you know? So I didn't sew for a long time, for several months. And this, what you see behind me, is the first full-size quilt that I made after he was elected. So I'd had my little time of hibernation, I was laying low, and then this quilt. And this was one of the quilts that, I have a group of quilts, or I have an approach maybe that I call oracle quilting, because I either intentionally start with a question and I approach the fabric with that, or sometimes I'm gonna sit down and sew, and then some kind of message comes through. It's the latter one that happened with this quilt, because I didn't sit down with any design in mind other than just like, I'm gonna sew some colors I like together, and that's gonna make me a little happier by the end of the day than I was in the morning, you know, and that was my goal. But I did that, and I made this quilt, and then I stepped back and looked at it on my design wall. And I mean, I don't think it's too grandiose to say I had a vision of the future when I saw it, right? It was this idea that even though we can't see our way clear into the future, it's still there, right? And the future can still be bright. And so in my mind, what I saw when I looked at this quilt were all these orange squares, like sunlight pouring in through a window, so that all we have to do when we need that access to that new future is just, one, give it time. That time is a magic ingredient. And then two, we just gotta step into it, right? And so every time I look at this quilt, I see the presence of something better, more ideal than what we have now, that might not be immediately sensible, detectable, but it is there. And so I think of that when I look at this quilt, and brings me some comfort.
Yeah, it's particularly timely. I'll say that we are recording this on the day when we are awaiting news of the 2020 election. So it's certainly this notion of the future and unknown is weighing heavily on my mind, at least. So
I think that's what they say for a lot of us.
Exactly, yeah. So you mentioned that this quilt was a comfort. Have you used quilt making in the past to get through other difficult times?
Well, yeah. Let's go back one.
Perfect. All right, we're jumping all over.
Okay, so this quilt, like I mentioned, didn't sew much at all when the president was first elected in 2016, but I could bring myself to sew small projects. And I remember it was January 2017. I had read this beautiful essay by Barbara Kingsolver I love her essays. Her essays are beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And she had written this one back in, must have been the 90s, must have been Bush 1, when she was talking about how the flag is so often viewed or associated with one political party, viewed with Republicans, viewed with the conservatives. When in reality, both parties have patriots, both parties have Americans, both parties have people that are loyal to their country. And so she was making the argument that Democrats and the left need to reclaim the flag as one of their symbols as well. And so my response to reading that essay was to get on an online merchandise retailer whose name I won't say on this show, and order this flag, this 100% polyester made in China flag. And I'm like, I was just about to click the button when I was like, Zak, what are you doing? You know how to sew. It's like I'd forgotten. Because I hadn't even made that other quilt that I showed you a second ago. I hadn't sewn anything in months. And so I sat down and I made this flag right here. From there, I started having these responses to the fire of the day. You know, whatever news item there was, I would process it by making patches here. So you can see here, Elizabeth Warren standing her ground, persisting. This came from an uncle of mine. A Great America Takes All of Us. You know, so many things, so many memories. It's kind of like, to me, a quilty newspaper or a quilty photo album.
It's a little, kind of time capsule a little bit, yeah.
And so I stopped at the first 100 days. And so I took all the pieces I'd made after the first 100 days of his presidency and put them together in this Oh America quilt as a way of just saying, come on, folks, we can do it. We just got to do it together, you know?
Yeah, that's
And this is my favorite part. So this flag, I knew I wanted to use it. I love this flag. It's got a lot of good mojo now because I've used it so often. I've taken it to protests and rallies and marches, all kinds of stuff. So I didn't want to like permanently incorporate it. So it is safety pinned quilt. And there's this panel underneath that just sort of holds its space.
I love that.
Right?
Yeah. It's got a designated place to come back to, and also still a message that flag's out there doing its work.
Doing its work.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's great. Do you feel like your life as a teacher and your life as a quilt maker intersect in any ways, either in sort of the skills you use, or like, do your students know about your quilts?
My students do know about my quilts, yeah. For sure, because I take some in from time to time to show them.
That's great.
Do they intersect?
It's fine if they don't. I'm just curious if you...
You know, no, but let's see if we can find a way where the Venn diagram overlaps. I do think, in the sense that my quilts are often contain a message. They teach in that sense, right? They carry some kind of meaning. I think there's something there that we could hang our hats on. I also think that quilting, and I'm also into fermentation. I love making right?
Sure.
So quilting and fermentation both have shown me that time is a magic ingredient, like I said a moment ago. That things happen that can only happen if given time, right? And I think teaching would also fall in that category. Like, you can't force a human, a student in your class, to perform well on a certain day, no matter how well you set them up for success. But one hopes that over the course of your time together, your course of your 9 months together, that you can move them from here to here. We're patient, we do our best, we wait and see.
Yeah, I think that's a great, those are great places for the Venn diagram to overlap, for sure. Let me see, I have so many questions I want to ask. I'm curious if you feel like you work in a community of quilters. I mean, I think I first found out about your work as part of the 43 for 43 project, which is a community project. Do you feel like you are working in a community, and do you enjoy that as any kind of collaborative work, or do you think sort of a head down solo approach is where you feel more comfortable? You
know, it's 1 foot in and 1 foot out. Like, it feels for folks that know the areas, like when you go to Carowinds in North Carolina, South Carolina, you get to straddle the state line, you know, North Carolina, right from South Carolina. I value strongly community. And I think at this point in my life, most of that is through social media, which can also be a challenging thing for me at times. I mean, those who follow me online will know that I post something. Sometimes I'll get on like a daily kick, and then sometimes I'll ghost for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, if we're honest, you know. And it can be tough because there are times when I'm in my darker days and I'm scrolling through Instagram, I'm like, oh, people are doing like such good work, and I am wasting my life. You know, like that goes through the noggin every once in a while.
Sure.
And I never want my work to be that for somebody else. So sometimes I'm like, no more social media. But then I start missing my friends, and I want to see what people are doing. So then I come back, you know. So it's an ebb and a flow thing. I do like collaboration. In fact, this quilt behind me, Heidi Parks helped me, and Heidi Parks also interviewed with y'all at one point.
Yeah. And
she helped me do a lot of this embroidery. We kind of did like a crazy quilt Americana type thing here. I'm working on a postal collaboration right now with a local textile artist, Palo Alto. And we are working on a square that we just mail back and forth, and we just add a little section, you know, and then when we get too big for an envelope, we just start over, you know. I would like to do more collaborations because I love that 43 for 43 project. You know, just a quick 10 seconds for folks who don't know it.
Yeah.
And there were 43 teaching students, college age students in Mexico in 2014, 16, oh goodness, that disappeared one night. They were abducted and disappeared. And so folks down in Mexico for a long time have been trying to raise awareness about, hey, where are these folks? We want them back. You know, the government won't tell me anything. And so when I was down there a few years ago, I was just so struck and impressed by how hard people were working to make sure these people were remembered and that justice was found for them. That when I came back, and I should say that I was struck when I went down to Mexico on that particular trip, that when I learned what the number 43 meant, because you saw 43 everywhere. There's like graffiti on walls, scratch on the restaurant tables, all kinds of. When I realized what 43 meant, I had this vague memory of scrolling past a headline on a screen months before and not clicking, not reading, not internal. And like, how can we? We can't read about everything all the time.
Sure.
But I was like, dag, it's good to be in the first world. It's good to be in the United States. It's good to be where, for the most part, we hopefully feel safe and comfortable, you know? So all of that went to my mind. I'm like, okay, so if I missed this and I'm someone who's interested in Mexico, Mexican history, Mexican culture, Mexican people, I'm sure other people missed it too. So I came back to the US and I organized this 43 for 43 project in which I rallied, well, it turned out more than 43, because in the end, I think we had maybe 64 participants.
Oh, wow.
Everybody made a square for one of the boys that disappeared. People embroidered their portraits, like Heidi embroidered a portrait for one of the guys. That everybody put their names on there. A lot of applique was done. And we made it into a long quilted protest banner that then I took to Mexico City with me, and with a mediator helped get it to the families, you know, that they can for whatever purposes they need to, you know, in the streets or to hang somewhere or whatnot. So I love collaborative projects like that because I do believe that there are things that can only happen when we're working together. And I would like to find, I got ideas. I mean, always, it's good to be me because I got ideas. The thing is, I just don't have the time necessarily to organize these things, but I am hopeful that one day I will, because I really enjoyed the role of organizer, and I enjoyed being the person that literally pieced it all together and thinking of ways to raise awareness and to use my time and my talent in ways that hopefully leaves this world a little bit better than it was before I plopped down in 1980.
That's a great answer and a great, I think, admirable goal. You mentioned, I mean, many of your quilts have messages. Why do you think that quilts are uniquely suited, or rather, do you think that quilts are uniquely suited for carrying a message?
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And I think it has to do with just how domestic they are, right? All forms of art, I think, have something special or unique that only they can do, right? That's why they exist as an art form. I would say one of the things that only quilting can do is take something so domestic, something so accessible, something that would otherwise perhaps be wasted, thrown away in the garbage trash can, and turn it into something else. And especially if we're thinking of some kind of community quilting, activism quilting, political quilting, there's ways to say, here, for example, this quilt, here are some things that really matter to me. In my heart of hearts, this is what I carry around with me on a daily basis. So I'm gonna reach into my drawers, I'm gonna take out my clothes, I'm gonna cut them up, and then I'm gonna make something beautiful to show you, right? In a similar way, in Latin America, there's this protest tradition of the cacerolazo, which is started often with women. When it was time to take to the streets to protest something, they didn't do a whole lot of organizing and like funding super PACs and all this kind of thing. They just went to the kitchen drawer, pulled out a pot and a wooden spoon and went to the street banging, right? Like it's taking what's in our hearts, readily accessible, democratic, and taking it to the public, putting it out there in the community. And so I think that's something that makes quilting especially suited for community engagement, for the public forum, and for sharing what's on the inside with everyone on the outside.
That's a great answer. I think, yeah, they have so many things going for them, and that kind of sometimes they're a little unassuming, which is really nice. It's sort of a soft way to get a hard point across.
You know, I love, like Emerson, for example. I'm working on this piece for Feel Good Fibers for their blog about the role that beauty plays in our work. Like, is it enough just to make a beautiful something, or does it need to have more meaning? And I think the inspiration or what got me thinking down that line was Emerson, who wrote this really beautiful poem to the rhododendron, right? He's walking through the woods of Massachusetts. He sees this rhododendron and he says that, you know, if the sages come and ask you, like, why do you exist, rhododendron? All you have to say is, beauty is its own excuse for being, right? Like, beauty is enough, you know? And so I feel like sometimes when I'm working, I'm like, okay, if this particular project doesn't have capital M meaning, that's okay. Emerson gave me permission to say, if it's beautiful, that's enough, right? And so I would lump Emerson in there with Thoreau. Definitely is one of my huge influence. I love that he's trying to see through the shifting sands of what was happening during the 1800s and try to predict kind of where we're going, try to see where we're coming from. I mentioned Barbara Kingsolver. I love her nonfiction essays. And I love poetry too, right? I mean, who doesn't love like Mary Oliver with her Wild Geese poem? And, I don't know. I read a lot. But yeah, so there's a few names folks want to a glimpse. That's some of my input, you know?
That's great. Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting sometimes to hear how people funnel all their different parts of their life and their brain into what they're thinking about. So I think this is also a timely question given the quilt you have behind you, but people typically refer to quilts as uniquely American art. We can argue about that as cows come home, but that's kind of the notion. What do you think that is the importance of quilts in American life? It's a loaded question, but if you want to talk a little bit about that.
I do love, and it kind of circles back to a few moments ago, but I do love that quilting is not usually something that's done in a studio. It's not done in a separate space usually. It's done in people's homes. It is the heart. I mean, when you think of the most private place in your home, I got two places. One's the toilet, the other one's the bed, right? Like,
sure.
When you think of the heart of your home, I would argue is your bed. And we're talking about making things for that space. And so when we choose to share that space with the outside world, there's this potential for something really special there, you know? So when you combine the fact that you're taking something that ought to be private and you're making it public, and you're working with something that everybody can identify with. Everyone wears clothes, right? Everybody wears fabric. It's our second skin, our second home. When you can make it something tangible that people can connect with, sometimes I think something can unlock or shift, or the needle can move a little bit. And so at a time when we are having trouble communicating, and by we I mean Americans, we're having trouble communicating with one another, there has to be some room in quilting for us to have something deeper than a conversation, right? Like something that helps us reconnect with what truly are our core values as Americans. I believe that almost all of us would think that goodness is an American value. Compromise has been a long American value. Consensus building, working together, getting the job done. I mean, these are things that we could really agree on. Mm-hmm. So the thing that happens though is that we disagree on the words to use, right? So maybe we take words out of the equation, we just pick up some fabric and needle and thread instead. And let's see what happens if we work together on that. I don't know what that looks like. I mean, it's been something I've been puzzling on. But I think there's space in the United States right now for some really powerful quilting projects to happen.
Well, that is, I can't wait to see them. I really hope that those will come out of this moment. So it has been really a delight to talk to you. Is there anything you want to add, or that you didn't feel like you got to share, or anything else?
No, I want to say thank you for this opportunity to talk.
Thank you.
It's always nice to talk to a like-minded soul, you know, and I want to thank folks for listening. They've been listening to this whole thing. I got a lot of questions, you know, about how life works. So if anything that folks have heard today in our conversation, like it sparks an idea, I would love to hear from people. And so maybe we can figure out a way to connect somehow.
Absolutely.
Because I do think that when we all put our heads together, we can see things a little more clearly, you know? Yeah, I know, I appreciate it. I'm very thankful for this time.
All right, well, I enjoyed watching that. I didn't so much enjoy watching myself, but it was just a fantastic conversation. And you'll note that I did have to cut some of it in the interest of time. And so we will show you in just a few minutes where you can see Zak's entire interview with links out to things that he mentioned and his inspiration and some of the work he mentioned by other artists. But I'm going to invite Zak to come answer a few of the great questions that we've got. And if you have other questions, you can put them in the Q&A and I will read them out to Zak. So yeah, thank you again, Zak. I hope that was, did you find that to be nerve-wracking? I always find it nerve-wracking.
No, no, it's actually pretty cool to see, like, to see myself, you know. I don't know. I don't sit around and usually watch my own interviews so much. So that was a treat. That was a treat. And I do just want to say a special hello to everybody out there watching. I appreciate you spending your time with us today. And a special hello to all the veterans, because it is Veterans Day here in the United States. So if that's you or if that's your loved ones, special hello to you.
Fantastic. Well, we have some great questions, some of which I know you already answered in the Q&A. I guess we will start. So Jules asks, what are some ways an unknown quilter in a rural area could do a collaborative quilt for awareness? You did the 43 for 43 project, and you've done other similar things maybe a little bit, but did you have anything you learned from that experience or tips that you might give to people?
Yeah, so Jules, I really appreciate your question, because it's something that it takes thinking through, you know, and I enjoy thinking through these kinds of things. And I think one of the beautiful things about social media is that it brings us so much closer in a lot of ways, right? So I've organized 2 major campaigns in the last 2 years. One was a 43 for 43 project The other was a Kickstarter to help me get a long arm. Because I think we might have cut this part, but my least favorite part of quilting is the actual quilting. Sorry if you love it, it's not my favorite. So I got a long arm. I just sew a bunch of long parallel lines on every quilt I ever make. But it did help expedite that part of the process. So anyway, so I've organized 2 big campaigns, and I feel like the trick to getting started is to, of course, make it something that people want to participate in, something that has room for personal creative interpretation, but not too much, because a lot of folks also like guidelines and suggestions. And then once you have the idea, then you need like a really great or really good, don't put too much pressure on yourself, video that you can share. I find that when you have a short video, maybe a minute or 2, that explains your vision, your drive for the project, what you want to do, then people can get on board with you. I had a really good response to the video, because when I started the 43 for 43 project, I believe I started with just posts, and I wasn't getting a lot of buy-in, but then the video made it come alive for people. And so I would suggest anybody, no matter where you're at, start with the idea, the video, and then see what happens.
I'm gonna put in a shameless plug here for the Quilt Alliance's video oral history project, because we found that we were recording these long form oral histories that are 45 minutes of sound and just text, and sometimes you need the snappiness of a video. So if you haven't checked out Go Tell It at the Quilt Show, Google that, you'll be taken to a YouTube. We have about 700 short 3-minute oral history videos. Check it out, just on the power of video. That's all I'll say. Thanks for letting me piggyback there, Zach. So we got a number of questions about your attraction to the quilts of Gee's Bend and your inspiration there. Somebody asked if you have visited Gee's Bend, I guess now called Boykin, Alabama, and also kind of where you see the line between appropriation and honoring or homage or inspiration. I mean, that's a thin line, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that.
I have not been down to Alabama yet, but I'm really excited about going, especially now that the new Lynch Memorial has opened up last year. COVID just kind of put the kibosh on that for the time being, but there's so many reasons to go down there. I would love to. I would love to see what that's like. As far as the line between honoring and appropriation, I continue to explore it, and I think the only way is to engage yourself and other people in this conversation. I think the first step is to acknowledge that, I gotta speak for myself. The first step for me was for me to acknowledge as a white man that I didn't invent this abstract improv art form, in case anybody is under any delusions, right? Like, just be very clear with your sources. So I've started there, but the rest is still a little bit murky or fuzzy for me. And so I would be interested in hearing from more folks on that.
Yeah, it's certainly a really hard question that I think a lot of people are struggling with. So I'm glad to hear your thoughts. Yeah. Let's see what other questions we've got here. I think we also had to cut part of this, but Jules asks, besides raising awareness, what do you use your quilts for? Are you connected with a gallery to show your work?
Oh yeah, so some of my quilts have been in galleries. I don't have a long-standing connection, but the various quilts have been out in various galleries around the country, which has been really sweet to see. I mean, I love my quilts just for what they are, but then you see them on like a real wall, surrounded by other people's pieces of art that would be considered high art, and it just feels like, oh, you ain't doing so bad, little quilt. You know what I mean? So that's been a treat to see that. A lot of my quilts have gone out into the world, meaning like I've sold them to people, and now they grace beds around the country and around the world. Some of them I can't part with, and so they're folded up and they're stacked, in the corner of, actually they're stacked on the long arm machine in our tiny 1-bedroom apartment. So half of them are sitting there. And lately I've become really interested, like we mentioned in the video, in memory quilts and memorial quilts, because I do believe that fabric is such an intimate thing. And it's something I've been talking a lot with people online, especially recently, about how the question of what to do with somebody's clothes when they pass is such a tough, sensitive question. you can't bear to get rid of it, but you can't keep it. So what do? And sometimes us quilters decide to make a quilt out of it. But even the process of doing that, of like taking the clothes and cutting them up, and that's difficult in and of itself. But I wonder, I haven't personally made a memorial quilt for someone that was really, really close to me. I've been making them for other people and their loved ones. I wonder what that process, how it would feel different if it were somebody that was close to me. I imagine it'd be incredibly difficult, but I also wonder what role it would play in the mourning process, moving you along in that process.
It's great. That's a great answer. And you do some commissioned work sometimes. So yeah, if zakfoster.com, do check out his website. I wish I could have included every photograph of all the quilts he made, because there's some really lovely ones.
There's a bunch on the website. Honestly, Instagram is what I'm using a lot. So feel free to connect with me on Instagram. If we don't get to your question today, or you want to talk some more, or you have some thoughts you want to share, you got a campaign you're thinking about, a project you're thinking about, we can connect. And I believe you shared that Instagram information, didn't you? At zakfoster.quilt.
Yes. So we'll go back to that at the end, but it is at Zak with no C and a K. Yeah, Z-A-K.
My parents, what can I say? Z-A-K. Yeah.
So definitely, please, you'll find him many places online. And we did have somebody who said, a teacher who quilts and ferments. I thought I was the only one.
Hey,
you also mentioned natural dyeing, and which I have been doing quite a bit of. Are there, besides fermenting, quilting, natural dyeing, are there any other projects that you are working on or starting to work on that you're really excited about?
Yeah. Okay, so Jane, I see you, teacher who quilts and ferments. I like that. Yeah, so I mean, I go from one passion to another, and so recently I've been working on a family history archive project. Because of my family, we have tons of old documents and photos and things. I've been scanning those in and like putting them online, including we have 150 handwritten letters from the Civil War. They're not in my personal possession, but they've been scanned in. They're at Duke University now. And so I've been reading through all this like almost 200-year-old chicken scratch calligraphy. Some of it's beautiful, some of it's really hard to parse. But I think after I just recently finished the transcription process of that project, and I think after studying 150 handwritten letters, it really stoked an interest of mine in calligraphy. And so I recently, my baby brother got married a couple weeks ago down in Knoxville. And so I dyed the pair of pants I was going to wear to his wedding, so they would match the look. You got to match the look in the wedding party.
Of course. And
I had leftover dye that I boiled down into ink. And so now I've been tying the natural dyes into inks, into calligraphy, and I'm having a lot of fun with that. So I'm finding that calligraphy is something my mom always did. So I have that as kind of a memory in the back of my mind. And I see what she probably liked about it, and that I equate it with ballet almost, right? That it's an art form that has to appear so graceful, but it's also very controlled, and like having the balance in between is meditative and a pleasure to kind of exist in that space for a little bit.
We have one more question, and then that is the last we probably have time for. A couple of people have asked if you've done any projects or have any ideas about doing projects with youth. If you've ever done a project with your students, or what your thoughts might be.
Yeah, so I did I didn't organize this project, but I was called in as like a expert last minute come save our quilt project person. There's a tenants' rights organization here in Flatbush in Brooklyn, and they had gotten a bunch of kids to draw on fabric blocks, envisioning what their ideal neighborhood looks like what they loved about their neighborhood in Brooklyn, or what they envision it could be. And I got to work with them on how do you take these, I don't even remember how many blocks we had now, let's say 50, and put them into quilts. Ended up we had 3 separate quilts of all these kids' drawings and words and text and African wax prints mixed in the middle. Like it turned out really, really lovely. So I haven't worked directly with youth, but I have had a hand in making their visions come together, and that was a treat.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again so much for interviewing and for joining us today. And I feel like people have other questions. Definitely get in touch with Zak. We're so grateful, and I am gonna share a little quick preview. So we've done Zak's interview. The question is now what happens? You know, we have audio, we have, in this case, we have video, and how do we make it useful? Because we have 1,200 oral history interviews collected so far, more than that actually. And we want quilt scholars to be able to access them. We want family members to be able to hear people's voices. We want people who are learning or just interested in finding a teacher to come to their guild to explore those interviews. So this is what our conversation turned into. I'm going to share my screen. So just one second here. And we're going to magically vanish to QSOS.quiltalliance.org and see this is how Zak's interview has been represented. So you can see that it's been broken into segments thematically, and each of these has a summary, and you can click on a segment that's of interest to you. So if you're really interested in doing research about quilts with messages or political quilts, you can hear what he has to say. In this section, he mentions the quilt maker Catherine Clark and her foreclosure quilts. So there's a link to her website. I noticed in our chat today, lots of people wanted TJ Muhammad's website, or a couple poems he mentioned are linked here. So we're really thrilled about this new way to present QSOS interviews. I think it's a much more compelling way to really hear quilt stories in the voice of quilters. But it does take time and energy to transcribe this. I had a little short video I was going to share with you, but I don't think we have time, of the transcription and indexing process. And we are especially grateful to Martha Seelman. You'll see here, you can sponsor a QSOS interview, which takes it from cassette tape that it might have been recorded on, or Zoom, all the way through this process of transcription, of indexing, which is describing the interview and adding that contextual information. We are starting to solicit volunteers as well. So if that's something that's of interest to you, you can email me at QSOS@quiltalliance.org. I'll bring up a little screen that shows that information shortly. But I do encourage you to check it out, to listen to Zak's entire interview. And many of the interviews that we've indexed so far are available at QSOS.quiltalliance.org. A few of them were recorded in 1999, some 20 years ago, and it's amazing to see how people's work has changed and evolved, and to sort of understand how the quilt community has changed. So I'm gonna bring up my little slide here, just one second. And of course, it's not gonna behave quite right, but just one second here. All right. All right, so here's our contact information, our website, and we are so delighted that you've all joined us. Thank you again, and please do feel free to get in touch. Thanks.